The rain started before noon and did not stop, thin gray lines sliding down the kitchen window while Emily stood at the counter, drying plates and thinking about nothing important, just the quiet rhythm of a normal Sunday in their Portland home, and she almost missed the sound of Daniel's footsteps behind her because he usually moved through the house with easy confidence, but that day there was hesitation in every step, a pause at the doorway, a soft breath drawn like he was preparing to jump into cold water, and when she turned, she saw something different in his face, not fear exactly, but a heavy kind of hope that made her chest tighten before he even spoke. Daniel had grown taller than his father, broad shoulders, thoughtful blue eyes, and at 22 he carried himself like a man ready for the world, yet in that moment he looked younger, almost like the 18-year-old who had once watched her carefully from across the dinner table when she first married Mark, unsure how to feel about the new woman in his father's life. And Emily remembered those early days clearly, the polite smiles, the careful words, the silent question that lived between them, "Who are you to me?" And she had promised herself back then that she would never push, never try to replace the mother he already loved, never demand affection that was not freely given. She had chosen patience instead, small acts of kindness, rides to practice, late-night cocoa during exam week, gentle advice only when asked, and over the years their relationship had grown steady but respectful, like a bridge built one careful plank at a time. So when Daniel finally said, "Emily, can we talk?" the words carried more weight than they should have, and she felt it instantly, setting the towel aside, giving him her full attention as the rain tapped louder against the glass. He stepped into the kitchen, ran a hand through his hair, and looked down at the floor before meeting her eyes, and that was when she understood this was not about a broken car or a simple favor. This was something that had been sitting in his heart for a while, waiting for courage. "I applied for something," he began, his voice low but steady, and her mind raced through possibilities, jobs, internships, travel, but she stayed silent, letting him find his rhythm, and then he said it quickly, almost like ripping off a bandage. "I got into a graduate program in Seattle," and for a second the only sound in the room was the rain and the hum of the refrigerator. Emily blinked, surprised but proud, because she knew how hard he had worked through college, how many nights he had stayed up sketching designs and researching sustainable buildings, how passionate he was about environmental architecture and creating spaces that respected the planet, a dream that did not always fit neatly into the plans his father had imagined. Mark had always pictured Daniel joining the family construction company in Oregon, expanding it, carrying on the name, and there was love in that expectation but also pressure, the kind that quietly shapes a young man's future without asking what he truly wants, and Daniel knew that, which was why his next words came out in a rush. "Dad doesn't know, and I don't know how to tell him," and there it was, the real reason he was standing in the kitchen instead of packing boxes in secret. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken because this was delicate ground, family dreams colliding with personal ambition, pride mixed with fear of disappointment, and she understood both sides too well, having watched Mark pour his life into his business and also having seen Daniel light up when talking about designing eco-friendly housing projects. "Why are you telling me first?" she asked gently, not offended but honestly curious, and Daniel's answer came without hesitation, "Because you listen." And the simplicity of that sentence hit her harder than any long speech could have, because listening had always been her quiet way of loving him, never loud, never dramatic, just present, and now he was trusting her with something that could change the shape of their family. He stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice as if Mark might appear at any second from the garage. "I don't want to hurt him, Em. He's done everything for me. But this is my chance. If I don't take it, I'll always wonder what could have been." And she saw the conflict in his eyes, the love for his father battling with the need to become his own person, and she remembered her own youth, the moments she had almost chosen safety over growth, and how different her life might have been if she had not taken risks, including marrying a man with a teenage son who barely spoke to her at first. She walked around the counter so they were standing face to face, not as stepmother and stepson divided by roles, but as two people sharing an honest moment, and she said softly, "Dreams don't wait forever," and he nodded, relief flickering across his face because she understood, but the hardest part was still ahead. He hesitated again, then added the request that would shift everything, "I need you there when I tell him. I can't do it alone," and the air seemed to still around them, because this was not a small favor like proofreading an essay or helping pack a suitcase. This was asking her to stand in the middle of a father and son conversation that could easily turn tense, to be the calm voice, the bridge, the steady presence, and she knew that stepping into that role meant risking her own comfort, maybe even facing Mark's frustration if he felt she had encouraged the move. She thought about her marriage, about the careful balance she maintained between supporting her husband and honoring Daniel's independence, and for a brief second doubt flickered through her mind. But then she looked at Daniel again and saw not a boy trying to escape responsibility but a young man trying to build a future he believed in, and that clarity made her decision simple. She reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his arm, grounding him, and said, "Okay, I'll be there," and the way his shoulders relaxed told her he had been carrying this fear alone for too long. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, but inside the kitchen something steady had formed, a quiet alliance built on trust. They talked for another hour, discussing how to approach the conversation, choosing a calm evening when Mark was not exhausted from work, planning honest words instead of defensive ones, and Emily coached him gently on speaking from the heart, reminding him that love and independence could exist in the same sentence. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the rain finally slowed, leaving the world outside washed and clean, and Emily realized that sometimes growth comes like a storm, loud and uncertain at first but necessary to clear the air. When Daniel finally left the kitchen to call a friend, she stood alone for a moment, staring at the damp garden through the window, feeling the weight of what she had agreed to, because saying yes meant more than supporting a graduate program. It meant stepping fully into her place in this family, not hiding behind politeness or staying neutral out of fear, but choosing connection over comfort. And she took a slow breath, knowing that the real conversation was still ahead, and that by the end of it, nothing would be exactly the same again. The house felt different that evening, as if even the walls knew something important was about to happen. And when Mark walked in from the garage after finishing a small repair on his truck, he greeted them with his usual warm smile, unaware that the calm dinner Emily had prepared was about to turn into one of the most honest conversations their family had ever had. They sat around the oak dining table that had seen birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sunday breakfasts, and Daniel kept glancing at Emily while pushing his food around his plate, his appetite clearly gone, and Mark noticed immediately because he had always been sharp when it came to his son. "Everything okay?" he asked, wiping his hands on a napkin, and that simple question opened the door. Daniel swallowed hard and began, his voice steady at first but tight underneath, explaining that he had applied to a graduate program in Seattle months ago, that he had not mentioned it because he wasn't sure he would get in, and that now he had been accepted into a respected university with a strong focus on sustainable design. And as he spoke he didn't rush, he explained why it mattered to him, how he wanted to learn new methods, how he believed construction could be both profitable and responsible to the environment, and how he dreamed of building communities that lasted generations without harming the planet. And Emily watched Mark's face carefully, seeing the pride flicker there at his son's ambition but also the shadow of disappointment because this was not the path he had imagined. Mark leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment, the ticking clock on the wall suddenly loud, and then he asked calmly, "So you're leaving?" And there was no anger in his tone, only a quiet weight that made Daniel's hands shake slightly as he replied, "I want to go, Dad, but I don't want to lose what we have here." And that was when Mark's eyes shifted to Emily, not accusing, but searching. "Did you know about this?" he asked, and she held his gaze without fear because she had promised herself she would stand steady. "Yes," she answered honestly, "he told me because he was afraid of hurting you," and the truth hung in the air like fragile glass. Mark let out a slow breath and looked back at Daniel. "Why would you think I'd be hurt?" he asked, and Daniel leaned forward, his voice stronger now. "Because you built this company from nothing, and you always said one day we'd run it together, and I didn't want you to think I was turning my back on you." And for the first time Mark's expression softened in a way Emily had rarely seen, because beneath his strong exterior was a father who had poured every hope into giving his son stability, and now he was being asked to release control. Emily reached across the table, not to interrupt but to anchor the moment. "Mark," she said gently, "he's not walking away from you, he's walking towards something he believes in," and her voice carried both respect and conviction, and she reminded him how often he had told stories about taking risks when he was young, about leaving his own father's hardware store to start his construction business despite doubts. And that memory seemed to strike him deeply because it was true. He had once stood in Daniel's place, full of ideas and fear at the same time. The tension eased slightly, and Mark nodded slowly. "I remember," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "It wasn't easy," and Daniel leaned in. "That's why I need you to understand, Dad, this isn't about running away. It's about building something of my own so that one day, if I come back, I bring more to the table, and those words shifted the energy in the room because they carried both independence and loyalty. Emily could feel the balance tipping toward understanding, but she also sensed Mark's deeper fear, so she spoke again, carefully. You're not losing him, you're watching him grow, and that simple sentence seemed to unlock something, because Mark's shoulders relaxed and his eyes grew glassy, not with anger but with emotion. I just don't want the distance to change us, he said quietly, and Daniel immediately shook his head. It won't. I'll call, I'll visit, and maybe what I learn there can help the business later. And for the first time that night a small smile appeared on Mark's face, proud and sad at the same time. The conversation continued for over an hour, moving from fears to practical plans, discussing tuition, housing, part-time work, and how often Daniel would come home, and instead of arguing they listened, truly listened, and Emily stayed present without taking over, guiding gently when words faltered, reminding them both of the love that held them together. By the time dessert sat untouched on the table, something important had shifted, not perfectly, not without emotion, but honestly, and Mark finally stood up, walked around the table, and pulled Daniel into a tight embrace that lasted longer than usual. I'm proud of you, he whispered, and Daniel closed his eyes as if he had been waiting years to hear those words. Emily watched quietly, her heart full, knowing that the hardest part of her role had not been choosing sides but choosing courage. And when Mark turned to her afterward and said softly, "Thank you for helping him speak," she understood that saying yes to Daniel's request had not divided the family, it had strengthened it. And as they cleared the dishes together in a calmer kitchen, the air lighter than before, she realized that sometimes love grows strongest when people allow each other the freedom to chase their own dreams while still holding on to each other. And that night, as the lights dimmed and the house settled into peaceful silence, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of expectation, but on the same side of understanding, ready for the next chapter even if it meant letting go. The weeks after that dinner moved quickly, as if time understood that change was coming and refused to slow down, and the house in Portland slowly filled with cardboard boxes, folded clothes, stacks of design books, and the quiet sound of tape sealing one chapter while preparing another. And Emily found herself spending more time with Daniel than ever before, not in dramatic talks but in simple, steady moments that felt meaningful because they were honest. Every evening after work he spread papers across the dining table, campus maps, apartment listings in Seattle, class schedules, and she sat beside him with a cup of tea, helping him compare rent prices, calculate costs, and plan a realistic budget. And she noticed how focused he was, how this wasn't a passing idea but a carefully built plan. And that seriousness filled her with pride. One afternoon they carried old storage boxes down from the attic, dust floating in the sunlight as they opened lids that hadn't been touched in years, revealing childhood trophies, faded soccer jerseys, and framed photos of a younger Daniel with missing front teeth and scraped knees. And he laughed at some of the memories, surprised at how small he once looked, and Emily laughed with him, though she had not been there for those early years, yet somehow she felt connected to the journey. As they sorted through keepsakes, Daniel grew quieter, holding an old photo of himself and Mark at a job site, both wearing oversized helmets, and he said softly, "He always believed I'd stand beside him one day," and Emily could hear the weight behind those words, the mixture of gratitude and guilt, and she answered gently, "Believing in you doesn't mean choosing your path for you," and he nodded, thinking deeply, because he was learning that love and expectation can exist together without controlling each other. Some evenings Mark joined them, offering advice about tools Daniel might need or contacts in Seattle who could help him find part-time work, and though there was still a hint of sadness in his eyes, there was also respect growing there, respect for the young man his son was becoming, and Emily noticed how Daniel's confidence increased with every supportive comment from his father. Late at night, after Mark went to bed, Daniel sometimes stayed at the kitchen table talking to Emily about his fears, about living in a new city, about making friends, about whether he was truly good enough for the program, and she listened carefully, reminding him of the long nights he had spent studying, the internships he had completed, the professors who had praised his ideas, and she could see doubts slowly turning into determination. Their bond strengthened not because of grand gestures but because of these quiet exchanges, because trust grows in small, repeated moments, and Daniel began to open up about things he had never shared before, like how hard it had been when his parents divorced, how unsure he had felt when Emily first entered their lives, and how over time he realized she never tried to replace anyone, only to care in her own steady way. and hearing that filled her heart with relief she didn't even know she needed. She had always wondered if he had accepted her or simply tolerated her, and now she understood that. Acceptance had grown quietly over the years like roots beneath the surface. As moving day approached, the reality of distance began to settle in, and one evening while packing the last box of books, Daniel looked around his room slowly, as if memorizing every corner, and said, "This house changed a lot after you came," and Emily smiled softly, unsure where he was going with that, and he added, "It became lighter," and those simple words meant more than he realized, because being a stepmother often feels like walking carefully through someone else's story, hoping to add warmth without causing disruption. The night before his departure, they all sat together on the living room couch watching an old movie, not really focused on the screen but on each other, and the comfort in that silence felt earned. Morning came too soon, the driveway crowded with packed suitcases and a car ready for the long drive north, and the air felt crisp and heavy at the same time, and Mark hugged his son tightly, his strong arms holding on a little longer than usual, whispering advice about staying focused and working hard, and Daniel promised he would, his voice thick with emotion but steady. When he turned to Emily, there was no hesitation, no awkward distance. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her in a firm embrace that carried gratitude, respect, and something deeper, belonging, and he whispered, "Thank you for believing in me," and she felt tears sting her eyes but kept her voice calm as she replied, "You always had the courage, I just reminded you." And as he climbed into the car and waved one last time, she realized that what had grown between them was not dramatic or complicated, it was built on honesty, patience, and shared vulnerability. As the car disappeared down the street, the house suddenly felt too quiet, but instead of emptiness there was a sense of pride, because they had not avoided hard conversations, they had faced them together, and in doing so, had strengthened something fragile into something lasting. Inside, she noticed Daniel had left one small framed photo on his desk, a picture of the three of them from a summer barbecue, laughing under the bright Oregon sun, and she understood that no matter the miles ahead, the connection remained. Later that evening, when his first text arrived saying he had reached his apartment safely and was excited to start this new chapter, Emily smiled at the screen, realizing that their relationship had shifted from careful politeness to genuine trust, and that sometimes family is not defined by titles but by the quiet choice to stand beside each other when it matters most. After Daniel left for Seattle, the house felt strangely larger, every room carrying a soft echo of his absence, yet beneath the quiet there was a new sense of strength that Emily had not expected, because saying yes to his request had changed more than just one conversation, it had reshaped the way their family understood love. The first week passed slowly, Mark walking past Daniel's empty room more than once, pausing at the doorway as if expecting to hear music playing or see books scattered across the desk, and Emily watched him carefully, knowing that pride and sadness often live side by side in a parent's heart. At night they sat on the porch with warm coffee, the Oregon sky stretching wide above them, and Mark admitted in a low voice that letting go had been harder than he imagined, that he had built his company with the dream of handing it to his son one day, and Emily listened without interrupting, understanding that his silence over the years had hidden deep hopes, and she gently reminded him that dreams can grow instead of disappear, that Daniel's education might bring fresh ideas, new designs, even partnerships that could strengthen the business in ways neither of them had considered. Mark nodded slowly, absorbing her words, and for the first time he said openly, "You helped me see him as a man, not just my boy," and that sentence warmed her heart because she had feared stepping into the middle might create distance between her and her husband, yet instead it had built deeper trust. Meanwhile, Daniel called often, sometimes excited, sometimes overwhelmed, describing his small apartment near campus, the busy streets of Seattle, the challenging classes that pushed him to think differently, and Emily could hear growth in his voice, a steady confidence replacing old doubt, and each call ended with gratitude, not dramatic or exaggerated, but sincere. One evening he shared news about a group project focused on eco-friendly housing for low-income neighborhoods, explaining how his ideas had been well received by his professor, and Mark listened carefully on speakerphone, asking thoughtful questions about materials and cost efficiency, and in that moment Emily saw a bridge forming between father and son, built not from obligation but from shared curiosity. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of their new normal settled gently, with video calls on Sundays and occasional surprise visits when Daniel could make the drive home, and each visit felt different, because he returned not as someone unsure of his path but as someone building it piece by piece. During one visit, While sitting at the kitchen table late at night, Daniel admitted that he had almost declined the program out of fear, that he had drafted an email turning it down before talking to Emily, and hearing that made her realize just how fragile turning points can be, how one conversation can shape an entire future. She did not see herself as heroic, only present, but Daniel insisted that her steady support had given him courage, and she accepted that quietly, understanding that sometimes influence is quiet yet powerful. Mark too began to change in subtle ways, opening discussions about modernizing parts of his company, researching sustainable materials, even considering partnerships with architects who specialized in green design. And though he never said it directly, Emily knew he was inspired by his son's direction. Their marriage grew stronger through these shifts, because they spoke more openly now about fears and hopes, about aging and purpose, about how families evolve instead of staying fixed in time. And Emily felt grateful that she had chosen connection over comfort when Daniel first asked for help. One crisp autumn evening, months after the move, Daniel returned home with exciting news that his project had been selected for a university showcase, and as he described standing in front of a crowd explaining his design, Mark's eyes shone with unmistakable pride. And later, when Daniel stepped outside to take a call, Mark turned to Emily and said softly, "You were right to stand by him," and she smiled, not because she had won an argument, but because love had won over fear. As the year continued, Daniel's visits became filled with discussions about internships and future plans, and instead of pressuring him to return permanently, Mark asked thoughtful questions about how his skills could one day collaborate with the family business, leaving space for possibility rather than demand. Emily often reflected on that rainy afternoon when Daniel first stood in the kitchen asking for support, realizing that the surprising request had never been about choosing sides but about choosing courage, about trusting that honesty would strengthen rather than break them. And she understood now that families are not held together by control or expectation but by respect and willingness to grow together. The house no longer felt empty but peaceful, because absence had been replaced with purpose. And on quiet nights when the phone rang with Daniel's familiar voice full of excitement about new ideas and challenges, Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing she had helped guide him toward independence without losing connection. Saying yes had meant stepping into uncertainty, risking tension, and trusting love to hold steady, and in the end it brought them closer than comfort ever could, teaching them that real strength in a family comes from allowing each other to rise, even if it means watching from a distance. And as Emily looked around the home that once felt divided by unspoken expectations, she saw not separation but unity shaped by understanding, and she knew with quiet certainty that the most surprising requests sometimes lead to the most beautiful transformations.